The 2023 season is a week away. The Giants going to Yankee Stadium to begin the journey of the season. So what is in store for the 2023 Giants? Did they improve upon their weaknesses from 2022? We'll get into it next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button if you are on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And coming up on today's show, as I said, a season preview for 2023 as we are a week away. I think tomorrow we're going to be doing a mailbag. Next week we're going to be talking about kind of finalizing the roster and getting ready for games. But today is the season preview for 2023, just an overarching look. What did they do in the offseason? How do they compare what happened last year and what's going to happen this year in terms of a best guess? Because it is hard to predict. And at the end, we're going to make a record prediction for the San Francisco Giants, and will they get back to the playoffs after missing out last year? But starting with the offseason, I mean, my goodness, it was an eventful one for the Giants, of course. No excuses. Like, they needed to go out and get superstar talent. It just felt like this was the time to do it. And when all is said and done, they didn't do it. And so it's very disappointing, despite their best efforts. But the issue that I have is that their best efforts, what was the plan in place if Correa failed a physical, right? That's the issue, is that there was nobody left. It was such a deep and loaded free agent class. The timing of it was like, okay, they want to go after Judge first. Judge was one of the first kind of big name players to sign. I mean, it took him a while. It was at the end of the winter meetings, which was like in early December. So it took about a month plus for Judge to sign ultimately. And then the Giants had their Correa deal in place a couple weeks after that. And so unfortunately, though, like, nobody had signed through the month of November. And there were players like Trey Turner who was out there who ends up going to the Phillies. It just, when you ultimately don't come away with one of the star players that you really sought after, then it feels really disappointing. But the Giants did pivot, and they were pretty active this offseason, among the more active teams around. And when all is said and done, they spent a significant amount of money. They just spread it around over a lot of guys. And so what they do is they bring in 2 outfielders, 2 starting pitchers, and 2 relievers. Essentially, those are their major league signings, and of course some minor moves, picking up guys here and there. But the 2 outfielders, probably the most significant to me. And what's especially significant here is that they didn't lose anybody from their outfield. So, like, okay, bringing back Joc Pederson too. Technically, he was a free agent. He had the Giants gave him the qualifying offer. That was a very aggressive thing to do. They did it. He accepted it. So bringing him back is a move that counts. But, he's not factoring into that outfield. And that's part of the equation here, is that the defense, and specifically the outfield defense, was such a problem in 2022. And so they sought out to address it. And I've made this point a bunch, but they didn't necessarily address it in the way that I feel like a lot of people think, okay, if this is a problem, the solution is to get someone who's like elite in this category and bring them in, like elite defenders left and right. But it doesn't have to be that. If you simply remove a guy who was among the worst defenders in the game, in Joc Pederson, for example, out of left field, and put in someone who's even halfway decent, that's a big improvement. And so they go out and they get Mitch Haniger and Michael Conforto. And these are 2 guys who have historically done well as defenders in the corner outfield. Now, both have also had injury histories, including, Conforto missing all of last season, undergoing shoulder surgery, but he's been healthy in the spring. This guy's been a monster offensively through long stretches in his career when he was with the Mets. He was just such a good young player with the Mets and kind of hit free agency at the worst time and then got injured while he was a free agent. And so that's why he missed all of last year. But this is a guy who gets on base, hits for power, really selective at the plate. And like I said, historically has been a good corner outfield defender. And so if Conforto can stay healthy and if Haniger can stay healthy, and like I said, it's not like they're replacing two key corner outfield guys who departed in free agency. These are just guys who are pushing others out of playing time. Like it pushes Joc Pederson out of left. And, another guy who got a lot of playing time in the outfield last year was Luis Gonzalez. And so it would have pushed him out of playing time, but he's dealing with a back injury. He actually had surgery, and so he wouldn't have been able to play anyway. But you also look at a guy like LaMonte Wade Jr., who played a lot of outfield. And so with Brandon Belt departing in free agency, that's one of the big stories of the offseason for the Giants is Belt and Longoria, two veteran players who were here for a long time, older players, slower players. In Belt's case, someone who was regressing defensively as well, moving on and giving opportunities to younger guys on the corners like LaMonte Wade Jr. and David Villar. And so what I'm trying to say is that I think they needed to go out and get some impact star talent. They didn't do it. That's a failure. But if you were to tell me they're going to construct a, off season without getting a star, but with just other players who are not stars, but are in a tier below that, I think they did about as well as they could have done. And it's a quantity thing because they bring in, 6 new guys to come on to a 26-man roster. It's a significant chunk of the team. And it's a team that a lot of people slept on as an offensive team in 2022 because I think that most people wouldn't know this, but the Giants scored, they were 11th in runs per game out of the 30 teams in the league. So I think that a lot of fans would probably say Giants were certainly below average. And it's just like this narrative that crops up each and every year talking about, the Giants are going to struggle to score runs and they need to win with pitching and defense. Actually, they're an above average offensive team. They have been pretty much every year for the last 3 years. And, in 2021, they were like the best in the game almost and hitting so many homers, etc. And so, like I said, they didn't lose a lot of key guys offensively, and they bring in 2 players who have the potential to be pretty big contributors from a run scoring standpoint in Conforto and Haniger. And so I'm not going to say I'm like bullish on them being one of the best offenses in the game, but I think they're going to probably be better than they were last year. And last year they were kind of quietly run scoring was not the problem. It was run prevention and it came down to defense. So coming up in just a minute, we're going to turn our attention to the run prevention side of things, continue to look at the defense, but also the pitching that the Giants brought in. They bring in 4 pitchers onto this team. So we'll get into it in just a minute. But before we do, this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Buying tickets shouldn't be stressful. And for me, a lot of times in the past, it has been. You maybe think you're getting the best price, but you're not. You maybe aren't seeing your fees are included until the last minute, and then you're blindsided by some higher number. Well, with Game Time, you can get the lowest price guarantee. You get images of the seat, which is a huge deal. You can go to any events in the area, whether it's sports, concerts, theater, or whatever. And more about that Game Time guarantee. It means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, here we go. We're going to continue to preview the 2023 season for the Giants. I've expressed that I was disappointed that they didn't come away with a superstar. It's important to keep in mind that I think that they go into an offseason and they, have a decent idea about who would play for them and who wouldn't, like given similarly competitive offers. And like, for example, Andrew Baggerly at some point wrote in The Athletic that he had it on, I think he essentially said good authority that he did not think Trey Turner would want to play for the Giants. And so you go into an offseason and like that's why we had circled Carlos Correa and of course Aaron Judge with the local ties, but Correa seemed like a guy who would kind of just go where the money was, and if you make him the best offer, that's gonna be real for him. And for Trey Turner, I mean, for example, the reports are that the Padres offered him, what was it, $340 million, and he ended up accepting $300 million from the Phillies. I know that the tax situation is a factor with California versus Pennsylvania, but it still was a better financial deal from the Padres that he turned down to go be on the East Coast. And so that's just a reality for some of the players. And so it's possible that they viewed Judge and Trey Turner and Carlos Correa as like the only two guys. And we don't know if they were in on any other top. We heard they made an offer for Brandon Nimmo, and he ended up accepting like a really big offer, bigger than anticipated from the Mets. And so it's, on the one hand, like it's a failure, like I said, but on the other hand, the way it all played out, I'm not sure there are too many deals I look to and say the Giants should have made that deal. Like Nimmo's deal, it's tough to lure a guy away from a team that won 100 games, and it's a really big offer relative to what expectations were, and it was the team he played for his whole career. And so it's just sometimes free agency is really competitive, and they had an agreement with Correa, let's not forget, and it just turned out he had something that was unexpected medically. And so they somewhat get a pass for that, but it's still, as a fan, like you're totally justified in being disappointed. But turning the page on all that, they do, have players that they bring in. And like I said, run scoring, it's not that they were great offensively last year. The runs scored kind of outpaced the like overall offensive production. If you look at like weighted runs created plus, for example, by the team, just like all-encompassing offensive metric, 100 is league average. The Giants came in at just 101. But guess who was at 102, for example? The San Diego Padres. Giants had a 315 on base. Padres had a 318 on base. So just almost the same. And slugging, Giants had 390, Padres had 382. So, if you want to win some trivia, I'm sure that a bunch of casual baseball fans would tell you 100% the Padres were better offensively than the Giants last year. And it's just, if by this metric, one tick above, literally 102 versus 101, but by runs scored, the Giants were better than the team that had Machado, had Soto for a couple months. No, they didn't have Tatis, and look, they're getting Tatis back. They bring in Bogarts. He was another guy, Bogarts, but he signed a contract like $100 million more than what expectations were, and so it was a bonkers offseason overall. But I don't know. There are a lot of teams. Giants outscored a lot of playoff teams. Even they scored like 20 fewer runs than the Houston Astros. The big problem for the Giants was runs allowed per game. So they play in a pitcher-friendly park, and yet they were not quite near the bottom, but bottom third-ish of the league in runs allowed. And so when you play in a pitcher-friendly park, that means that you're even worse than that if you kind of adjust for the park. And it was largely defense-related, because if you look at any defensive metric, defensive runs saved, outs above average, looking at ERA versus fielding independent pitching, which tries to take, fielding out of the equation, hence fielding independent pitching. So the Giants' ERA last year was 13th in the league at 3.86, but their fielding independent pitching was 3.46. And so that 3.46 FIP was second in Major League Baseball. Would you believe that? They had the second best fielding independent pitching in Major League Baseball, ahead of the Dodgers, behind only the Houston Astros, and yet their actual run prevention was in the bottom third of the league. How does that make sense? Well, fielding. And so, again, I don't think you need to bring in a bunch of elite defenders to necessarily address this. We look at 2021 when they had a lot of the same guys. Like it wasn't a major overhaul from 2021 to 2022. And you might say, well, Chris Bryant, but guess what? Bryant was terrible defensively when he was here by all the different metrics. And so Conforto, Haniger, if they can be healthy, and then Slater, Yastrzemski, Slater's hurt right now, but Bryce Johnson, I don't know if he can hit enough to factor in Blake Sable, Rule 5 pick, who very well may make this opening day team and get an opportunity and may play in the outfield because currently Haniger is dealing with an oblique issue. But I really do think that they've done enough to be at least adequate defensively. And I think adequate would have been enough to put them in a much better spot last year. They were that bad where it really cost them a lot of wins with their defense. And the infield defense is a whole other story. But if you look at the players who kind of cost them defensively, if you look at individual players by like outs above average, for example, it was a lot of guys who are no longer here. Brandon Belt cost them defensively last year by the metrics. Tommy La Stella, certainly, I don't think anyone will argue with this, cost them defensively in the infield. Who else cost them? Like Donovan Walton, who's not going to really factor onto the team, cost them defensively in the infield. If you look at defensive runs saved, Thairo Estrada was not good, but if you look at outs above average, he was. And so, I don't know, Kevin Padlow, there are just a bunch of guys who don't figure to be in that mix. So it's more like Wade, Flores, both of whom have done solid defensively in their careers at first base. Flores, not so much at other positions, but at first base, yes. Estrada, I believe, can be good defensively or at least decent. Crawford, of course, we all know, struggled at times, but really was good in the last couple months. And then at third, David Villar, kind of an unknown, but they've said that they believe he can be at least average and maybe even a little better than average defensively. And of course, you got a guy like Casey Schmidt waiting in the minor leagues. But if you start to have some injuries, then I do have concerns about the defense in the infield. If suddenly you've got to play Wilmer Flores or JD Davis at third or at second, suddenly if Thairo Estrada's at short and who knows is at first, like Joc Pederson has been getting reps at first in the spring. So a couple injuries and you start moving guys out of position, and then I do have some concerns there. But with the way it is now, I think that they should be much better than they were last year. A lot of it being addition by subtraction. Darren Ruff was a guy who really hurt them defensively when he was here last year. Another guy who was on that 2021 team, and it just didn't factor in as much. I think they got unlucky in a lot of ways with their defense. They were bad and unlucky. Like just a lot of tweener balls like that were just kind of just out of the range of some of these guys that were maybe routine flyouts in 2021. So who did they bring in, though? So I've said that I think the defense should be okay, injuries notwithstanding. But in terms of bringing in pitchers, they bring in 4 pitchers here. And who do they lose? They lose Carlos Rodon, and they bring in Ross Stripling and Sean Manaea. So more about those two, and then the 2 relievers, Taylor Rogers and Luke Jackson, in just a minute. But before we talk about them, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The tournament is heating up, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back up to $1,000 if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the net. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. All right, here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the pitchers that the Giants brought in. It's an interesting equation because what do? They let another ace walk away in free agency, just like they did with Kevin Gausman, who goes to the Blue Jays last year. They got ace production out of Carlos Rodon, as they hoped they would. He opted out of the second year of the contract, and he leaves. He goes to the New York Yankees, signs for 6 years, $162 million. And what happens to Carlos Rodon after one spring start? He gets shut down due to a forearm strain. And so it's an ominous beginning to the contract for Carlos Rodon. And it's just a good example of the Giants could have signed him, but then they'd be looking at the same situation the Yankees are looking at right now, which is that he's currently hurt and not going to factor in for at least the beginning of the year. So the Giants will not face him after all in that opening series in New York. So obviously you can't judge a 6-year deal in, before it's even started essentially, but it's not a great beginning. And it's just an example of how pitchers are vulnerable. And I don't know. I mean, Mitch Haniger's also hurt, so it's not like this only happens to pitchers, but we'll see. And we'll see how Kevin Gausman's deal continues to look. There's just a long track record of long-term deals for starting pitchers not going well over the duration of the deal, including a lot in Giants history. So Carlos Rodon was the big loss for the Giants. They also DFA'd Tommy La Stella this offseason, but when I looked through who did they lose, I mean, it was Belt, Longoria, like I said, and then Carlos Rodon. And so they did not really have major losses outside of Rodon, and they bring in a bunch of guys, like I said. And on the pitching side, who do they bring in to replace Carlos Rodon? Well, they bring in 2 starters. They bring in Ross Stripling, coming off a really nice year in Toronto, and Sean Manaea coming off a really bad year in San Diego. But both players have track records of being at least kind of decent mid-rotation type pitchers. For Stripling, it's more of like a swingman role. He's kind of pitched out of the bullpen as well at times, but he's coming off such a good season in Toronto, and they get identical 2-year deals with an opt-out after the first year. Stripling has said that the opt-out is what made him choose to sign here. Like, he wouldn't have signed with the Giants. The Blue Jays were offering him the same deal, but without the opt-out. And he said the opt-out made all the difference. And so a lot of times people don't like the opt-outs, but it's how you get these guys. Like, you wouldn't have gotten Rodon in the first place if you weren't willing to give the opt-out. And so it's like, you cannot like it, but would you rather have not had Carlos Rodon last year? Well, and you might say, well, just sign Kevin Gausman. And that's a fair argument. But I say, let's see how the whole contract plays out, and then we'll ultimately judge it when it's over. But yeah, so Ross Stripling and Sean Manaea, and then they also get Anthony DeSclafani back from the ankle surgery. And so it's kind of like another pitcher gets added there. I'm not saying give them credit for adding another pitcher, a guy who's coming off an injury. But what I am saying is when you project that rotation, you're looking at 3 additional starters essentially and losing 1. And so it's just a deep group that includes Logan Webb, of course, and Alex Cobb, who had those, may have been hurt more than anyone by bad defense last year. And then Stripling and Manaea and Alex Wood coming back and hopefully rebounding, coming off a down year. Jacob Junis is in that mix in the bullpen, and DeSclafani. And so it's just a lot of starting pitchers, and then you've got some intriguing depth. Sean Jelly has put on 15 pounds of muscle and is throwing harder in the spring. You've got Kyle Harrison, a top prospect in the game, going to AAA. You've got Tristan Beck. You've got Keaton Wynn. So the Giants have some pretty impressive starting pitching depth. And then in the bullpen, this was another, if I had to point to kind of 2 things that were a major weakness in last year's team, it would be defense and the bullpen. And in the bullpen, they kind of remade things a little bit on the fly as the season went on last year. And some of those guys are back. Like, for example, Scott Alexander stands out as someone who came in late last year. I mean, he's really the only guy, actually, when I look at the projected pen. The other thing that happens here is that having that starting pitching depth allows them to slot a couple guys, or at least one, into that bullpen mix, like Jacob Junis. He was a starter for much of last year, but he kind of factors into the bullpen now. And then you look at a Sean Jelly, that might be how he gets broken in. And then you've got 6 starters outside of that. And so you could have a guy like Sean Manaea or DeSclafani pitching out of the bullpen, or piggybacking starters, so giving your bullpen an extra rest day, etc. But Camilo Doval returns, and you all know I'm super high on Camilo Doval. They signed Taylor Rogers, the twin brother of Tyler Rogers, who's historically been one of the better lefty relievers in the game. Big strikeout guy, 3-year deal. Nice signing. I like it. And then bringing back John Brebbia, coming off a good season. Tyler Rogers, of course, perpetually underrated, also hurt by defense a little bit, and just kind of bad luck, I would say, last year. Scott Alexander, ground ball machine. And that's kind of the bullpen mix. So I think that if their defense can be, if you could tell me right now that by like defensive runs saved and outs above average, the Giants were going to be average or better defensively, then that would be like probably the main indicator for me. Health is another one. I'd have to know, do Michael Conforto and or Mitch Haniger get over 400 plate appearances? That would be another major indicator for me. And then health in the rotation, like Webb and Cobb, Webb specifically. So health is going to be key, but also defense. And if you could tell me that they were decent defensively, I'd say like for sure over 500 and with a chance to be a 90-win team. With a chance. I didn't say for sure. But as it is now, I'm kind of hedging my bets because I don't know about health. No one ever does. And then, defensively, I think that they should be able to be at least decent. But I thought that going into last year to a large degree because it was a lot of the same guys and they were decent in 2021, if not better than that. And so when all is said and done, this is a team that last time I gave a number prediction, I predicted for 87 wins. I kind of want to walk that back like 1 win or so, 86 and a half. But it's baseball and predictions are really difficult. Feel free to leave your prediction in the comments below and maybe we can look back on this when the season is over. But, what were people predicting going into 2021? A lot of people weren't predicting over 500. They won 107. Last year, a lot of people were predicting in the 90s and they win 81. And so it's just hard. Maybe this year they find themselves somewhere in between 88, 89, 90. I would definitely take that. And then in terms of making the playoffs, it puts the Giants like kind of right on the fringes of the playoff picture if they do win somewhere in the mid to high 80s. And so that would be my prediction. And hopefully just in the race, I mean, hopefully they obviously make the playoffs and win the World Series, but only one team does, and there are 30 teams out there. So that's my prediction. I guess I'm going 86, coming down a win from last time I made a prediction. Let me know what yours is below. And thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen. Now, for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Baseball. Win your league by listening to Matt and Dom every day as they bring you the best fantasy draft strategies. Find Locked On Fantasy Baseball wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like the show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. Helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Mailbag episode. Look out on Twitter for the prompt. A week away from the season. I can't wait. So thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.